Hi, welcome to HowtoDandD. My name is Fred Wheeler and today I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. And this video is more for the Dungeon Master than for players. Hopefully this will give you an idea about how you in your own game, when you've got a big baddie and there's an army, so an army of forces, how do you play out mass combat, massive battles? How do you do that effectively in Dungeons and Dragons? Because that's where the designers started. Wargaming, that was my origins too. I played more war games, tabletop war games, than I ever did Dungeons and Dragons. So how do you make that feel exciting? Because it's the exact opposite to what Dungeons and Dragons is. Usually Dungeons and Dragons is about a small scenario or situation rather than great huge sweeping arcs. So this particular video is Dungeons and Dragons 5e Massive Battles, the Trebuchet. Now, in a battle that's large, often there'll be a catapult or a trebuchet, there's siege equipment. So how do you make a massive battle interesting in Dungeons and Dragons 5e? Well, there are 5 things that I think you can potentially do to make your adventure more interesting. And the one I'm going to select for you is the last one. So first one is all you do is just narrate the battle, nothing else. There's no input by the players, there's no input in chance of success or failure. You've already predetermined exactly what is going to take place. It is not necessarily the most fun way to run a massive battle. So usually most people don't do it that way, but it can be used that way. The other option, and that is to still narrate the battle, but ask your players to make key decisions. And those key choices and decisions have like a flow chart that you have developed, and they have some dice rolls involved to see how well they are able to be successful at performing those particular tasks. That's quite involved and complicated, and it still doesn't have the flavour of Dungeons and Dragons. It still feels more like a tabletop game rather than anything else. But there's still hope, because choice 3, and choice 3 is not one I like, and that is to use the Dungeons and Dragons 5e mass combat rules, which you can, I suppose, but I personally think they suck. Now, when I say suck, I mean really suck. I mean, I wouldn't even bother touching them. If you feel that they will work for you, by all means, go for it. But I'm going to suggest a different option. The other option is you can get completely crazy, and so this would be option 4, is set up your entire table with all of the army's miniatures and try and play the whole thing out. Now, it's lunacy. That would be absolutely crazy lunacy, and I wouldn't recommend doing that. You're now playing a tabletop war game rather than playing Dungeons and Dragons, so why would you do that to yourself? The last option, and the one that I think works the best, and that is to take elements or events that are part of the overall battle. So little pieces or bite-sized sections of the battle that take place between two armed forces that are fighting it out in a massive battle. That is how I run my mass combat rules. So it's not mass combat. What I've done, I've simply broken it up into pieces. The players can choose which part of the battle they are part of. They can decide, make decisions, and it's very, very simple. And then once you've done that, all you have to do is create an encounter around that situation. In this case, I'm actually going to use artillery, because I feel like that's probably the best place to start. Because what you're after, and I know I was after the same thing, and that is that awesome Lord of the Rings battle scene. That's what we're after. Or a lot of us were running Tyranny of Dragons at some point, played Horde of the Dragon Queen, and we were hoping to get to Rise of Tiamat, and that would be a mass battle at the end between two forces. And of course there's nothing in the Rise of Tiamat anything like that. So this encounter I created for the Rise of Tiamat, and it's pitching basically the forces of the Sword Coast against Tiamat's Cult of the Dragon army. And I started with artillery. I start with artillery and siege weapons and catapults and the trebuchet because, one, that was what would normally be doing most of the damage at long range. It would be difficult to get across a battlefield without not being hit or large portions of your forces being destroyed by long range fire. That's just always been the case with any battle. So for today, I have set up a little scene for you, and I'm going to just play it out and explain what I did in my adventure. So this is the mission. The mission is protect the trebuchet from the Red Dragon assault. Now I know you're thinking, ooh, red dragons, they breathe fire. How are they supposed to protect the trebuchet from an assault? I selected 2 trebuchet. Each trebuchet has armed forces. So there are 6 men or women, 6 armed forces for each trebuchet to control it, to make sure that it does what it needs to do. And on top of that, I provided 2 leaders. So there's a leader for each trebuchet to give instructions and, if necessary, if the forces get badly damaged, to take over lost positions, to continue firing the weapon should that happen. But that shouldn't really happen, right? Because normally you wouldn't be able to hit somebody's artillery, not unless you're using your own artillery. But this is Dungeons and Dragons, and there are dragons involved, right? So that means you can fly those little suckers over there and cause an awful lot of damage. So what I set it up as is the Sword Coast, the Lord's Alliance, and all the forces that have pulled together to fight against the Cult of the Dragon. They have to deal with an assault from red dragons that fly in from afar. So they're going to fly in and make basically attack rolls, or should I say breath weapon attacks against these weapons and potentially try to rip them apart. That's the intention of this encounter. And I'm going to use quite a few dragons because I don't want this to turn into an encounter where all they are worrying about is destroying and killing dragons. If it's all only about killing monsters, then it's not going to be quite as interesting. This is more designed for high-level play or characters. The purpose is to stop the red dragons burning the catapults, not to actually kill the dragons, which my players did not figure out. They didn't realize that, okay, maybe the best option, since these things are flying in and they're not landing, is that we don't try and attack them. So hopefully when you run something like this, your own players will figure out they need to be a bit more creative than that. I started the battle at a range of about 600 feet. I used 1 young red dragon for each character against these 2 trebuchet. So if I had a group of 4 players, and right now I'll just move these out of the way. These are our characters. These are wizard, cleric, rogue, barbarian, this is Dritzt, and this is a ranger. And I would have selected, if there was a party of 6, I would have selected 6 dragons. Now the reason I'm doing that is deliberately so they don't try to focus on, okay, this is a winnable situation by just shooting them at range, at long range, because I don't want it to turn into that sort of encounter. What I want them to do is think about how they can protect the trebuchet. So that's why I selected so many dragons. You don't have to do the same thing. You can change it if you want to. I also started at long range because I figured that long range made sense in this situation. It's a big open battlefield. And I waited until each dragon, so when I was running the dragons through, if a dragon fell to half their hit points or less, that dragon would bug out and fly away. So the dragons don't fly and attack and engage in a battle till they die. Their intention and instructions are fly in, destroy the trebuchet. Now this is taking place right along the artillery units. All that's taking place is the players are going to hopefully be in a situation where their trebuchet are the only ones still surviving. So they're only playing out a small section. So if the dragons fall to half their hit points or less, they retreat and fly away. Each of the standard troops only have 1 hit point. And I did that because it didn't make any sense. If they get hit by a breath weapon or attacked, I want them to simply perish very quickly. They're not superheroes, they're not special characters or anything like that. So I turned them into minions. I gave them an AC or armor class of 16 should they get attacked. I did give them a dexterity saving throw of +1, but really chances are if they get hit with a breath weapon, it's going to kill them anyway, so it really isn't very important, but I did make sure to assign that value to them. The Trebuchet has 150 hit points, so each one of these Trebuchet has 150 hit points. They have an armor class of 15, and you can find all of the details for the siege equipment on page 256 of the Dungeon Master's Guide, for those of you who want to sort of make sure you get all your stats and so forth figured out. I figured the players might want to try and use the Trebuchet to shoot the dragons out of the air. So they have an attack roll, the Trebuchet, of +5 when the men are firing it. It has a range of 300 feet up to, with disadvantage, 120 feet. So that means that it will be a little while before the dragons will be in range where they don't have disadvantage. But I also applied a disadvantage to their attacks with a trebuchet because they're shooting a flying or moving target. A trebuchet is much better at targeting something that is staying still, because it takes a long time to load it, aim it, it's traveling a long distance, all those sorts of things. So it's not like firing a longbow. Much more complicated, much more difficult to be accurate with something that's shifting and moving around, particularly if it's flying in the air. So even if they get into a range of 1 to 300 feet, I'm still applying disadvantage to the attack. Now I know that sounds like terrible, but the reason behind it being is that there's no point in trying to do this if all you do is make it easy for them to shoot the dragons out of the air, because that's not the outcome I'm looking for. The outcome is I have my dragons fly in, attack with their breath weapons, and fly back again, and that should polish off the trebuchet, right? What I want them to do is I want them to think outside of the square. How much damage do the trebuchet do? They do 44 points of bludgeoning damage on average, or you can roll the dice. Have the players often, I let the players do all the dice rolling in this case, so that's 8d10 or 8 10-sided dice worth of damage. Now, what sort of scenarios or things can you do in a situation like this? I explained to them it was up to them to figure out all that sort of stuff. What I did is I selected the concept of your spells. So I had them decide on which battle they would engage with. They picked the trebuchet because it was the most immediate threat and the one that was highlighted. And they could have summoned a water elemental to douse down the trebuchet so that they were harder to burn. They can use their men to fire. Also, they can use their men, if they're still alive, to put out fires if the thing is burning. And that would reduce damage as well. It's really up to you. I found that, I just allowed them to roll a 6-sided dice to determine if somebody was trying to pat out fires to reduce damage by about whatever they rolled on a 6-sided dice. And you decide what that can be. It could be smaller than that, could be larger than that, but I figured a 6-sided dice was reasonable. It takes one of the men, these little men that they can order around, it takes them an action to do so though. They can summon a wall of water, or a wall of force to protect it from the fire that's incoming. So there's lots of different spells in Dungeons and Dragons that allow for this sort of thing. And that's why I set it up this way. It's not about killing the dragons, it's about making sure the trebuchet stay intact. And eventually the dragons will fly away because hopefully they've taken enough damage. Now, some of the players might engage in helping to fire the trebuchet. They can give orders, which is just really a free action. They can do other things. They can make attacks with spells and long-range weapons. I did make it clear before I set up this battle to players that they should all have long-range weapons, even if they weren't very good with them, and they had built a character that was only really good up close with close-quarter weapons. They needed to have something that could deal with firing at a distance. And really, I played it out, and my group weren't successful. And the reason they weren't successful is they did nothing about protecting the trebuchet. They didn't have buckets of water to try and douse fires. They didn't wet down towels or blankets or their own clothing and throw it onto the trebuchet to stop the trebuchet from burning, because wetting it down would have been a smart move. If they had something like there's a spell that allows you to create sections of force that would have been able to be placed around at least one of the trebuchet to stop it from taking damage. So a lot of them did not have those sorts of spells. What they were thinking was, we are just going to engage in a straight out, tough it out fight. So I don't know if you'll necessarily have found this interesting, but I want you to let me know what you thought of this. It is certainly one of the more unusual things I've done in my game, where I've used massive combat to try to make it more interesting. What I also did is I didn't just have the players have to deal with this situation. I also, once they had run through this encounter, they said, well, what about the enemy's trebuchet? What about their artillery and catapults? Can we attack them? And I said, absolutely. And they said, well, do we have dragons? And I said, yes, you do have dragons. You can jump on a dragon, fly over there, and have the dragons attack the trebuchet and the catapults that the enemy have, and see how well you can do. And of course, they did exactly that. They created a few other alternative motivations and achievement goals in the process. Some of them decided that it was important to not just take out artillery, but to try and see if they could find key individuals in the force to attack. Now, the dragons they were riding, I controlled. They could give them instructions, but if the dragons took half lost half their hit points, they would retreat and fly back to the Sword Coast's forces, rather than continue fighting to the very, very end. Because once the players drop into the enemy's forces behind lines, it doesn't mean that everything's going to go well. In fact, if anything, it's probably going to get much worse. So yeah, give me some feedback. Tell me whether you would use this encounter as a dungeon master, if this has helped you understand how you could run a massive battle in your game of some kind. I have many videos on Dungeons and Dragons, which you're welcome to go and check out for players and dungeon masters. I have a Patreon account if you want to support me, so I make more videos of this type, or any type really. I have affiliate links to the book depository and Amazon, where you can buy stuff online from Amazon, the book depository. Those affiliate links there support the channel. And remember, share, like, and subscribe to the channel. I wouldn't necessarily hit the bell button because I'm going to be doing a lot of live streaming and you'll probably get pinged quite a lot. Not to mention that the bell button doesn't really work very much anyway, so who would really worry about that? And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.